Today's daf is daf kuf chaf, and the Gemara is continuing where we started yesterday with the machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. And this has to do with the laws of a yad and a shomer. And the Ika de Masnile, which begins this sugya on the top of the Amud, Amasnisen, that there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish on our Mishnah that begins this perek, Ha'or Varot V'Kippah, Mitzarfin L'Tamei Tumas Ochlin. And the question is, in all these cases that are listed here, including Atzomos, and the Mishnah stipulates that these hides, etc., are able to be integrated into the Tumah of Ochlin, Reish Lakish, Lo Shanu Ela Etzem. Reish Lakish understood that hairs cannot serve as a shomer, because if you want to lift something up with hairs, the hairs will rip immediately. And therefore the Mishnah, by classifying the etzem as a shomer, is limited to the etzem, because the etzem is something solid. Aval nima, but hairs, lo avi shomer. Right, as we said before, you cannot upgrade hairs to the status of a shomer such that it's mitzarif to set up the shear for Kabbalas Tumas Ochlin, which is kibetza. And Reish Lakish is going to be mekileh because he holds that hairs will rip and tear. It's not a shomer. But Rabbi Yochanan Amar, afilu nima nami havi shomer. And Amar le Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan, miika shomer al gabi shomer. I mean, how could you say that there's a shomer on top of a shomer? And this was the sugya that we had on Kuf Yud Tes Amud Beis, that a hair could not serve as a yad to lift up the flesh, but rather as a shomer. And Rabbi Yochanan had said that no, a hair could actually serve as a shomer. How so? Chalchule mechalchel. That the hairs actually pierce through the hide and they reach the basar below the hide, so that the hide itself is the shomer that protects the flesh. And you might have argued that the hair on top of the hide is a shomer on top of a homer, on top of another shomer. And we established in Rabbi Yochanan's frame of reference that no, it's not a shomer on top of a shomer, but rather the hair pierces through the hide and has direct contact with the meat. So it's not, with a shomer in the middle that separates the hair from the meat. And maskif law, Rav Ach, as we had yesterday, if you're telling me that the hairs, in this case the hairs on top of a parchment, on top of a cloth, will pierce holes through the cloth, then in that case you have a cloth that's full of holes, and the ink that you use to write the parshios of tefillin will now fall into these holes. And that's not ksiva tama. Ksiva tama means that there's an uninterrupted ink through the osios. And the Gemara says, no, ishtamise ha, the Amri Mavarav, you forgot that which we learned from Eretz Yisrael, called nekev shadio over lavenu nekev. This is not called the nekev as far as ksiva stam is concerned, because what happens is these holes are so microscopic that the ink passes over them and doesn't drip into the hole. Eisvei Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, What are we going to do, Reish Lakish, according to you, with the Mishnah that we have later on here in Masechta Chullin on Kuf Chav Dalet, or Sheyesh Lav Kazayis Basar, Hanogeh B'Tziv, Hayotzi Menu. Tziv is a sliver of meat that protrudes from the hide, and that piece or sliver of meat has in it a Kazayis Basar. So that itself is not a kasha on Reish Lakish, because here we're talking about the hide, which is clearly a shomer. But then the Mishnah continues and says, Ubisar Rosha Kenegdo Tame, which means that the seir, the hair itself, growing from the hide, opposite the flesh of the meat, is tame. Must mean that it's a shomer. And yet Reish Lakish denies that hair could be a shomer. My love mishum shomer, lo mishum yad. So now you're telling me that what the Mishnah had in mind when it spoke about seir shekenegdo is a yad? What does that mean? That you could pick up the flesh of the meat with the hair? Nema achas l'may chazir. Well, what kind of yad is it? Yad means you grasp it and it picks up the utensil, or in this case, the flesh. So Maretzes Kida Amar Aviloi B'malai Shebein Amaloim. We're not talking about one single hair, but as Rav Eloi said in a different context, we'll see which context in a minute, a bristle amongst many bristles, Hachanami B'neima Shebein Anemin. So there are many strands of hair that if you grab all the strands as a bundle, then you'll be able to lift something, and therefore it becomes a yad. And Hechi Yitmad Rabbi Eloi, what was Rabbi Eloi talking about in his context when he spoke about a bristle amongst many bristles? A Hadisnan on the Mishnah of Miloi Shebeshibolim, Mitamim Umitam. Mitamim, they receive Tumah and they transmit Tumah. V'ein mitztarfin, but you cannot, let's say you want to get the shear of a kibetza in this shibolet, in this grain, and it doesn't have a full shear of kibetza, then you cannot integrate the malai, meaning the bristles, together with the grain itself to form a shear of kibetza. So now the Gemara asks, malai, what are you talking about? You're saying that the malai has some sort of a din of a yad, and it's not mitzaref because it's not a shomer, but how could it be a yad? I mean, it's one single bristle. What does it fit for? You know, you pick it up and it tears. Many bristles. Okay, now we get back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, harotev, that the gravy of the meat will be considered like meat, and therefore it integrates into the ochel, the meat, to make up a shear of kibetza and bimitame, my rotev. Omar of Ashumna. Rotev is the fat that comes up on top of the meat sauce. Amalei Abai, Abai says to Rav, what are you talking about? Our Mishnah is talking about integrating into the shear of the meat of a kibetza. Hu atzmo yitami tumas ochlin. If this is in fact the gravy that rises up, and it's not added gravy from the outside, but it's fat that rises from the top of the meat, then it in itself is tameh. What do you mean to say that it helps the meat in order to convey tumah? Ella, so therefore Abai disagrees with Rava and offers an alternative interpretation of Rotev. What is Rotev? Chelev de Krish. Okay, now we talk about liquids that congeal and become like solids. And even though chelev per se could be considered a meat unto itself, and that's what we've been assuming all along. So you don't need the Mishnah to tell me that the gravy here integrates with the meat to make up the shear of a kibetza, and now you're telling me it congealed. So what do you gain by that? I mean, nothing has changed. The chalev is chalev, which is basar. I don't need to combine it together with the basar in order to create the shear of ochlin of kibetza. My area krish kilo krishnami. You should have no need to take this chalev and subject it to to undergo a process that'll make it congealed, even if it's not congealed, even if it's liquid chalev, which is called tsir, Amrei Shlakish, tsir shal gabe yerek. Right? Let's say you have, tsir, which is like a liquid substance that's resting on top of vegetables. Mitztaref. Okay, so now we get to Yom Kippurim. The Torah prohibits achila on Yom Kippurim, and it's a very severe Isur. Obviously, it's a chiv misa b'dei shamayim, and now the question is, what about liquids? So liquids come under drinking, not under achila. But with regard to Yom Kippurim, eating and drinking are all included in the prohibition of Yom Kippurim. How much do you eat on Yom Kippur in order to incur a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim? It's called a koseves hadgasa. Koseves is a kind of a date, but it's a very large date. And if I'm not mistaken, in the last parak of Yoma, we find that Achilan Shasi on Yom Kippurim, if you ate a Koseves Hagasa, incurs a Chiv Karis, which is more chomer than Misa B'dei Shamayim that I mentioned earlier. In any event, if you have this full measure of Koseves Hagasa, of food, which is solid, or beverage, which is liquid, then although you cannot integrate the food with the beverage, but if you had a koseves hagasa of one or the other, either of solid food or of beverage, then you chayiv kares. And Rish Lakish tells us that the sap of these greens combines with the greens itself in order to make up the shear of koseves hagasa. And that's true even before the sap is congealed, because it's considered a foodstuff. So why do you have to tell me that the chalev is congealed? And the Gemara says, you know what? The underlying kasha that you're asking is predicated on an analogy between Yom Kippurim and Kabbalas Tumah. Yom Kippurim is a separate halacha. A person is desperate on Yom Kippur, will eat anything if you would allow him to. And therefore, Hasam Mishum Yisuvei Daitehu. The reason why the Torah prohibits eating or drinking on Yom Kippur is the Torah doesn't want you to get into a mindset of being Yishuv Adas, of being, eased from the affliction of Inui on Yom Kippurim, of hunger and thirst. Is therefore b'chol dehu miyasv'daite. Give him any amount of food and any kind of food, even the liquid sap of greens, and it somehow will put his mind at ease. But here with regard to Tumas Ochlin, mishum it's terufehu. We want to know if the meat is integrated in order to set up the shear of kibetza for Tumas Ochlin. And here we're going to say the following, that when we talk about this congealed chalev, then ikarish mitztaref, only if it's congealed, then it's considered like basar to combine with the meat as one entity to generate a shear of kibetza for Tumas Ochlin, but ilo karish lo mitztaref. If it's not congealed, it doesn't combine and integrate with the meat in order to set up a shear of kibetza for Kabbalah's Tumas Ochel. Now we go on in the Mishnah of Akipa, which is sediment, right, that combines with the meat, again, integrated into the meat to form a shear of kibetza for Tumas Ochel. In my Kippur, what exactly is the sediment? Omar Rabba, pirma. Okay, fine. Rabba tells me it's pirma. What is pirma? That I don't know. So he says here that pirma are the dregs of cooked meat that fall to the bottom of the pot. I don't get it. What difference does it make if the meat is on the top of the pot or the bottom of the pot? It's meat that's makabel tumah. It's food stuff. Why are you telling me that it combines and integrates the mash and the shear? It itself is a food. What we're talking about are spices. What happens is that you add spices to season the meat. It's a separate entity from the meat. It's not basar. And it remains sometimes in the pot. And the Mishnah wants in Mechadish that since these spices were added to the pot in order to flavor the meat, therefore they are integrated together with the meat to be mashal the shear, and they have halacha of clinching the Kabbalah's Tumah of both Lachnosa and Lahotza. So these spices are never eaten by themselves. They're eaten together with the meat. They're not subject to Tumas Ochlin in and of itself, but rather they combine and integrate with the meat for Tumas Ochlin because they are added to the flavor of the meat. Tanan Hasam we learned in a Mishnah. Actually, I'm not sure that this is a Mishnah. I think it's a Brisa. Okay. God is good to us, Asher. From now until the end of the daf, there's a digression, and we can breathe a sigh of relief from Ha'ar Varotev, Tumas Ochlin, Tumas Nevela, Shomer, Yad, Kibetza, Kizayis, etc., etc. So I thank the Almighty, because for here till the end of the plot, we're okay. Once we mentioned this idea of taking chelev and causing it to congeal, which means taking a solid, and if you, let's say, put it on hot fire, you make it into a liquid. So now we're going to take a tiyul, we're going to take a trip throughout Shas, all the Isurim, and we're going to analyze what happens if you take an Isur that's a solid foodstuff and you convert it into a liquid. Does the liquid have the same status as the solid? And we begin with the brisa that says, Hikfa es hadam. Okay, here's the opposite direction, where he takes a liquid and makes it into a solid. He takes blood, and by applying heat to the blood, it becomes congealed and a solid. And then he ate the blood. And now we have the opposite direction. Oshe himchas achelev ugmo. He took chelev, which is a solid, and turned it into a liquid by dissolving it, and then he ate the chelev. And it's interesting that both chelev and dam are chiyuvei kares chayev. So the Gemara says, "Bishlem hikvas adam v'acholo." I understand that maybe it's not so appealing to drink dam as a as a liquid. I don't know. I'm sure if you're if anyway, I don't know, bloodthirsty cannibals. I don't know. Some people probably eat dam, but for us, if you heat it up and you make it into something congealed, I don't know, take a bite of the solid dam. Anyway, kevan di akve achshuve achshve. He's only elevating it to a better status, a better situation that's more edible. a person who takes the trouble to solidify the liquid state, the liquid blood, is demonstrating that he values it as a solid. He's doing this deliberately. So it's sort of like Yule Aile Lishmirasa. He's upgrading the status of the dam. Elahimchas achelev ugmo. I mean, chelev is not drunk as a liquid. Normally speaking, you take chelev and you roast it on the oven and you eat it as solid meat. And achila ksivbe. And when the Torah prohibits us from chelev, it says lo sochlu kol nevela. And holav achila. Achila and shtia and drinking are two separate two separate actions. And now he's drinking that which the Torah prohibits for eating. How could he be chayiv? Omrei Shlokish, we have to derive this from a special pasuk. Omakra nefesh l'ravos sashosa. The concept of a nefesh is always related to something that you drink. So although the Torah says ki kol ochel chelev v'nichrasa hanefesh ha'ocheles me'ameh, it says ocheles and ochel, but nevertheless it also says hanefesh. And the word nefesh, or the soul, is used when it connotes desire or satisfaction, gratification of the soul, as it says in Yesh es nafshechem. And nefesh, with regard to chelev, tells me that if you consume the chelev in a way that it pleases you, then you're chayev. So even if you drink it in a liquid form, that's included in the prohibition. But please note that we needed a special pasuk to establish that when you convert a solid into a liquid, you're still chayev, and that's by chelev. And the question is, can we use chelev as a binyanav to derive other isurim? And Tanya Namiyochi, we find liquidating chametz for the isakares, ki haigav in the same similar way, himcho gmo, right? You liquidate, you turn the solid chametz into a liquid, and you drunk it down, then since it's chametz, it's onish kares. Or, for example, let's say you took matzah, you might think that, okay, if you're telling me that chametz turned into a liquid is chametz, and I'm chayv kares, maybe in the flip side, if you take matzah and you convert it into a liquid and you drink the liquid matzah, you'd be mekayim the mitzvah of matzah. No, matzah ain't on the yotzei yidei chovaso v'pesach. And why is that? Because the Torah calls matzah lechem. Lechem is solid. Bishleim, I understand it. Matzah ein adam yotzi yidei chavasu v'pesach. Lechem oni omer achmona. The Torah calls matzah lechem. Hai lam lechem oni. I'm not sure if the word oni here is so important. I think I would read it hai lav lechem hu. You don't have liquid lechem. I don't know. There are a lot of types of breads out there in the market. I've never seen liquid bread. Maybe it exists and I don't know about it. Anyway, the Torah says, this is not achila. You converted the chametz into a liquid and you drank it. On Reish Lakish Omakra nefesh. The Rabbi Sashosa. That likewise, in the parsha of chametz, in Shmos Perek Yud Beis, it says, Ki chola ochel chametz v'nichrasa hanefesh. And nefesh means even shesia, because as we said before, shesia satisfies the gratification and pleases the person, puts him at ease. So now again, we have two cases. We've got chelev and we've got chametz. And in both cases, we have a special pasuk to indicate that you're chayev even for the liquid. Now we go on to what's called the velas oftar. Right, so there's a special din that if you eat a kezayis of an oftar that died without shechita, then it's metami bebeis abliya. Now, what happens if you took the oftar, and the nevela, and you turned it into a liquid? Tanya nami gabi nivlas oftar ki agavna himcho ba'or tame. So he took this nevela and he put it over a fire and he made it into a liquid. He dissolved it and he swallowed it. So if he made it into a liquid b'chama, right? He just left it in the sun, then and he ate it, he's not tummy. But if he heated it over the fire, be'or, then he's tummy. Probably because if he does it in the sun, then it's going to come up in the Gemara soon that it's not edible because the sun causes it to become farshtoket. Anyway, how could you be chayiv if you swallowed an oftar that you've burnt over the fire and converted into a liquid? Achila ksiv. The Torah speaks about the achila of the nevela of the oftar. Shrinking is not called achila mreish lakish. I'm a third time. Nefesh. The rabbos, as I shows, the Torah says in the parsha of Nivlas oftar, called nefesh shetochal nevela, etc., etc. The Tomei Adar. And nefesh is the rabbos shall see hochi bechama nami. Bechama is ruche misrach. It putrefies, and it's no longer edible. Okay, utzrichi. Now, why do we need 3 times nefesh for chelev, chametz, and nevela of an oftar? Tzrichi. If we only had the ribui of nefesh to teach me that Yechayev for drinking chelev is chametz losim, we could not derive chelev. I'm sorry, we cannot derive chametz from chelev. Why? The Torah is more machmir in chelev than it is in chametz. Why? Shekein lo haiselo shasa kosher. Right? Chelev from its inception in the body of the animal is awesome. But chametz is mutter in and of itself the whole year round. 51 weeks out of the year. Why can't we derive nevelas oftar from chelev? Losimine. Because you can't onish kares. The Torah is more machmir in chelev than it is in of tameh, because of tameh only generates malchus, but in the case of chelev you get kares. Because Rahman of chametz, let's try it a different way. Let's spin it around and let's write nefesh by chametz and let's derive chelev and of Tame oftar from nevelas oftar from chametz. That we can't do either, because chelev lo asimina shekain lo huta mechlolo. Okay, there's a little bit of machlokas here what huta mechlolo means with regard to chelev, but chametz on Pesach is also no matter what. Whereas chelev, if you take it from a chaya and not from a behema, then it's mutter. Nevela lo asim, and I can't derive nevela from chametz. Shekein onush kares, where Torah is more machmir in chametz because it incurs kares, whereas the violation of nevela is only a violation of a lav, and you get malchus. Ikas rachmana ben nevela. Nevela lechora should be a great paradigm, because nevela is not lo haisa lo shas kosher, and not only that, it's a chiyuv lav and not a chiyuv of kares. But hanach lo asiminesha came mitama, because nevela has an extra chumrah that it contaminates, it conveys tumah. We don't find that with regard to chametz or chelev. Frek the Gemara, chadam echad lo asya. Okay, I understand that if you're deriving one from one, that you can't do, because in each one for one relationship we have a chumrah that is a pircha on that derivation. But teisei chadamitarti, can't we set up a binyan, a tzad shava, would we take 2 and derive the third, and therefore we have the kasha? Why in the third case is there a nefesh? We don't need that drush. We could derive it from tzad shava. Hey, teisei. Okay, let's see. We have 3. So you can have any combination of 2 out of the 3. Let's go through them. Maybe we'll have the 2 of chametz and chelev. But both chametz and chelev are 2 machmir that they both incur a chiyuv kares, and therefore you can't derive nevela from a chiyuv kares, because nevela is only a chiyuv la. Maybe the Torah was more machmir in chametz and chelev, And therefore, the Torah went ahead and said that even the liquid of chametz, the liquidated chaylev, is chayah. Let's try a different combination. Why can't we use chaylev and nevela to derive chametz? And you're not going to be able to say that they're chayev kares, because chametz itself is chayev kares. You can't derive chametz because chametz, the Torah was mekil, because the Torah allowed you to eat chametz the whole year round. Whereas, chaylev and nevela is prohibited the whole year round. Well, let's try a different combination. Can't we derive from chametz and nevela chaylev? Because chametz hayelo shas hakosher, so you can't tell me, well, chaylev never had a shas hakosher, and you can't tell me, well, chametz generates a chiyuv kares, because we want to derive chaylev, which is also a chiyuv kares, and you can't tell me, well, let's not derive anything from nevela, because nevela has the additional dimension of tumah, because chametz doesn't have tumah. But the Torah has a kula in chaylev that doesn't apply neither to chametz nor to nevela, and that is that chaylev is mutter in the case of a chaya. Now, I gave you the final conclusion of this Gemara that the kula of chaylev is that it doesn't apply to a chaya. But the Gemara doesn't know that yet at this point. That's the final conclusion. What is this kula that applies to chaylev and it's absent in nevela and chametz? After all, you could take chaylev and burn it on the mizbeach. That's called an achilas mizbeach. So the Gemara says that's not a unique kula in chaylev that you could burn it on the altar, but nevela nami. Why? Where do we find that nevela goes on the mizbeach? That's called malika. Why? Because what's malika? Malika means you take an oath and you do something which is not shchita. It's malika, and it creates nevela, and yet we burn it on the mizbeach. Ella, but rather, says the Gemara, chaylev chayla hedjot. Let's go back to our regular consumption, our us guys, regular guys. And in the case of chaylev chaya, we're allowed to eat the chaylev. Frek the Gemara, nevela nami, istre malika dechata sof lekohanim. You're telling me the chaylev has a kula because you can eat the chaylev of a chaya. Well, I'll tell you that you can eat nevela if you're a kohen and it's malika, an oath. So Gemara says that's not a fair comparison. Why? Olam chaylev chaya lehejet. As far as chaylev is concerned, we have a kula that the chaylev of a chaya could be eaten by anyone. Udekakashalon, and you're telling me but kohanim are allowed to eat nevela in the case of malika? Kohanim yishulcha gavah kasi. That's a whole different halacha. Once you bring it on the mizbeach, and the Torah says that you bring this nevela of malikas chatas of onto the mizbeach, now the kohanim eat that which is on the mizbeach. They're not eating something that's really inherently, in and of itself would be mutter. The kohanim receive portions of offerings, right, which they're not allowed to eat until after Zrikas Hadam. The kohanim are shluchei derachmana, they're servants of the Ribono Shel Olam, and they receive portions from the master's table. The permit to eat after malika, in the case of a chatas ha'of, is affected by the fact that the offerings belong to the Ribono Shel Olam. It's not really a permission to nevela for us common folk. So it's radically different than chaylev, because in chaylev, even us common folk, we're not kohanim, we're allowed to eat chaylev of a chayav. Anyway, just to sum up, if nefesh had been written in 2 cases out of the 3, we would not be able to successfully set up a tzad hashava. Therefore, the Torah had to say nefesh over and over again 3 times to be machmir that you chayav even for the liquid of chelev, nevela, and in the case of tuma, oath, tameh. What are we going to do with a brisa that says hatmeim? So this is a pasuk in Vayikra Yud Aleph with regard to shrotzim, and shrotzim are considered hatmeim, and there's an extra hay of hatmeim as a ribui lesar tziron v'rotvan v'kipush alehem, to include. Again, this is a little disgusting, but you take a sheretz and you heat it up, and you end up with like juices and gravies and different small sediments. So what'd you do? You really converted a solid into a liquid. Lamali, why do I need this pasuk ligmar mihani? Certainly from chelev, nevela, and chametz we could derive shrotzim. If we didn't have shrotzim, havamina dayalevamina din lios kinodem ayosam adika kizayis adhocha nami adika kizayis. We have a special halacha in shrotzim that you don't need a kizayis to be chayiv, because the birya, it's a complete creature as created by God. That gives a chashivus, and therefore, since the Torah has to teach us this new chumrah of birya with regard to shrotzim, yichayif even less than a kizayis of a sheretz, what would happen if you had a liquid? So obviously the law would be that a liquid of less than a kizayis would be chayv. But how do I know that? Because the whole derivation of liquid comes from these 3 cases, and in these 3 cases, there ain't no such thing as less than a kizayis, because we're not talking about a birya. So that ends Kuf Chaf Amid Aleph.